a working paper and still work in progress, and I would really like to seek criticism, comments on this paper from you. Ashley has already given some very devastating critique of my paper to me, and I'm thankful for that, and I'm trying to incorporate that to read my paper. I will read my paper because so that I can keep to time and I can be specific. The paper is already circulated and you can have it, you can read it for all the sources. This paper attempts to develop a critique of the argument of civilizational advancements as a plea for abolition of death penalty. Analyzing some recent literature on abolition of death penalty, I will argue that even the apparently sophisticated arguments of abolition endorse a civilizational thesis. Such an argument is premised on compelling of the non-Western nation state to climb up the evolutionary ladder and catch up with the progressive and civilized notions. I will argue that the civilizational thesis inadvertently reinstates the colonial ideology of evolutionary progressivism. I then discuss how it is the idea of the civilization itself, following Freud, which invents the prescience that constitutes the psyche of the modern citizen subject. Finally, I take up the notion of psyche via Nietzsche to rupture the seamlessness of the subject of law. I use psychoanalysis to argue via Derrida that a meaningful opposition to death penalty has to institute a breaking of coherence of the legal subject and an acceptance of the unconscious that Nietzsche presages in his genealogy of models. Only that can be a truly principled opposition, and we were talking about principled oppositions to death penalty. It is in this original spirit of Nietzsche that we imagine nihilism, nihilism not as something negative, but something like a critique, which is, as the old German sense, something which is to be productive. A critique which would give birth to or a search for a principled opposition of death penalty, a critique of the affects and effects associated with death penalty and punishment, as such requires to dare to live in uncertainty and negate the codes of violence that form the fabric of the self. It is the analysis of the self or the psyche that can provide the beginnings to understand the malaise of the society. After all, as Peter Goodrich has reminded us, the social as a subject performs the mimesis of characteristics that are found in the individual subject. Collective identity is deemed to be just as phantasmatic, as driven by pleasure and pain, desire and fear, as a self-image of persona of the individual. As the Western legal tradition has long recognized, a nation is a system of simulations and it acts as if it were a subject. A search for the opposition of death penalty, which is principled, cannot be unmindful of the fact that abolition cannot be just erasure from the statute book of the penalty of death. It can't be just the erasure of death penalty as a punishment. The fundamental insight of psychoanalysis is that no simplistic erasures are possible. The end of death penalty must also mean the prognosis and containment of the eruptions of drives and fears based on violent impulses or desires in individuals to cause death as murder, or in the social for death dealings such as war. This paper assumes critique as an ethical commitment which is beyond everyday calculations or transactional interests. The impetus for this paper comes from the work of Jacques Derrida, his seminars on death penalty, where he points to the notion of interest as opposed to opposition. So interested as opposed to a principled opposition. Interest as related to some kind of a calculation or search for profit. This may be either monetary, psychological, search for a greater well-being or a greater good, increase of enjoyment. In what follows, I'll begin to try to unpack the idea of the civilizational thesis. An opposition to death penalty invariably involves exposing the savagery and barbarism associated with the notion of death penalty. Those espousing for the cause of abolition have often taken recourse to this argument that death penalty is savage and barbaric. It is argued that the institutionally sanctioned way of putting an end to life is a remnant of a savage and bygone era. Xavier Yanez, for instance, arguing against death penalty in the US context, remarks, death penalty, I quote, should be abolished because it is a barbaric form of punishment which should not be allowed in the United States, which is supposedly one of the most civilized nations of the world. One cannot miss the emphasis on the most civilized as a characteristic marker for the United States. Death penalty must be abolished, so the argument runs, because the most civilized nation should not hold on to the form of penalty which forms the habitus of the barbaric and uncivilized parts of the world. The foundational assumption is that criminal law of civilized nation states does or should not have barbaric features. H.S. Gore, who is an authoritative writer on criminal law in India, in a similar vein denounces death penalty, saying that no civilized country today imposes such heavy sentences as the penal code does. Heavy sentences have long gone out of fashion in England, and the odor of sanctity and perfection attaching to the penal code should not deter indigenous legislature to thoroughly revise the sentences and bring them in conformity with the modern civilized standards. Despite the well-meaning intent, the unspoken motivations to catch up with the civilized world undermine the logic of abolition and reinforce the colonial Eurocentric ideology of your evolutionary progressivism. Michelle Miao, in her analysis of the Chinese legal framework in the context of Chinese death penalty, maps the transformation from cruel displays of taking lives in China to a relatively civilized approach. Her diction provides sanction for the necessarily coercive measures that may be taken in order to catch up with the civilized standards with respect to death penalty. She argues that South Asian states need to be informed, and I quote her, about the position of the other countries on capital punishment policies, and by forcing them to accept their status as rogue states in the international community, unquote. She further contends that exposing China's practices in the field of capital punishment to the global media discourse has forced China to rethink about its capital punishment policies and has made China to reconsider whether it should insist on its excessive capital punishment policies and whether such policies comport with China's self-perceived identity as a civilized nation and responsible member of the global community. It is important to pause and raise some questions about such formulations. Miao's argument rests on the idea that death penalty is a dent on the self-image of the so-called first world nations, or it is a reflection of the uncivilized character of nations belonging to the other worlds, which should now be on the roads towards civilization. A familiar colonial framing exists in this formulation of movement from barbarism to civilization. The colonial experience has informed us of the pathologies intrinsic to the evolutionary discourse that draws a linear trajectory towards the progressive future. In the context of death penalty, this teleological movement is perceived as automatically towards the more civilized nations of society. What are the implications of this civilizational argument for non-European, not yet civilized nations? How, for instance, should one understand global media discourse that Miao talks about that has forced the Oriental other to reformulate their policies on capital punishment or accept their status as rogue state, which is an interesting expression we all know. In the same vein, she also mentions the Europe's self-perceived identity as a normative promoter of human rights values has found profound expression in the international pursuit of abolition of death penalty. Indeed, the mission to eradicate death penalty from the statute books is a part of European Union's foreign policy. The civilizational argument clearly envisages an anti-death penalty we, believing in the preservation of human life, as a form of penal evangelism. We who seek to solve the penal barbarianism and them who are the recipients of such efforts. This divides so deep in the pathologies of the colonial ideology that reinstates itself in a new form with all its force. Following Derrida, the civilizational argument is an argument of interest, something which strengthens the logic of the nation-state and nation-state rivalry, far from being an argument in principle against death penalty. This diagnosis of the interest in arguments of abolition is what, according to him, is needed in order to philosophically sharpen our understanding about the phenomenon of death penalty. One can well recall the concluding paragraph of seminar 6 on death penalty, where the imploration goes that we must broaden the analytic of interest to the social or national or state body and ask ourselves what interest a state, a nation state, or even a global state might have in maintaining or suspending capital punishment. Dissection of civilizational argument is in no way a suggestion to dilute the argument for abolition. Instead, the aim is to understand the unspoken and latent implications of the death penalty debate. This discussion must alert us not ever to be unmindful of the logic and justification of colonial violence. Both at the individual and social level, formations and formulations of sentiments come into play and play an immense role in understanding the punishment, which is a part-time moving that what is the role of this of civilization in creating a psyche, and what is the role of emotion or public sentiment and a catchy phrase, conscience of people in determining punishments. To illustrate, one has to glance how the majority in the Bachchan Singh famous judgment took recourse to the democratic sentiment of public in order to retain death penalty in exceptional cases. The Indian Supreme Court registered its dissent with the US court's Furman versus Georgia. One of the judges, Justice Sarkaria, speaking on behalf of 3 other judges, again accepted the standards of morality of the American people as a lesson for the Indian court. He pointed out, and I quote, Furman, the honorable judges claim to articulate the contemporary standards of morality among American people, but speaking through public referenda, polls and state legislature, the American people sharply rebuffed them. We must draw the lesson from the same. Evocation of public sentiment and democratic guiding factor as a democratic guiding factor for penal policy framed the judicial understanding regarding death penalty to a great extent. Such formulations replete the judicial canon in many other cases, even though at times it borders to the level of absurdity. Another important case of Machi Singh versus State on death penalty, the court referred to the community's collective conscience as an appropriate yardstick for infliction of death penalty. The community, the court said, would not impose death penalty in all cases. However, it would expect death sentence if the community's collective conscience is so shocked that it will expect the holders of judicial power center to inflict death penalty irrespective of their personal opinion. The notion of collective conscience also found its way in the infamous Parliament attack case. The Supreme Court justified the infliction of death sentence on Afzal Guru in the following terms. The incident, which resulted in heavy casualties, has shaken the entire nation, and the collective conscience of the society will only be satisfied if the capital punishment is awarded to the offender. And needless to say, the interests again, which we talk about, that obviously Afzal Guru being a non-Hindu, and Afzal Guru being somebody who's hanging, would also have the interest of the nation state, not to say the Hindu nation state. The passage in particular justifiably drew scathing criticism against the Supreme Court at various forums. However, as pointed out, neither such vacuous recourse to public sentiment in neither novel nor surprising given the history of judicial discourse on death penalty. Such remarks of collective conscience expose both the history and the unconscious of the judicial discourse on death penalty. It is this irrational and unconscious fear that is inextricably linked to the institution of punishment. The phenomenon of punishment becomes an outlet where such latent drives find their way out. Here, the relationship between increasingly security-oriented state and latent emotional impulses is equally important. That why do we want, or as someone said, why punishment pleases? Why is it so pleasing? And in this context, one has to investigate the contemporary fetish for the security and all kinds of penal brutalities sanctioned for security that Mrinal was talking about. In the infliction of death in cold blood, the society acquires a shape of the sovereign beast who kills in cold blood and rejoices the killing of an alter ego of the condemned. The civilized mask here gives way to hidden face of beastly aggression, which unleashes itself in the form of realization of sadistic fantasies. This gives a hint towards the understanding of enjoyment and festivity associated with punishment, which Friedrich Nietzsche so often talks about in his discussion on punishment. In fact, it's interesting to note how many times Nietzsche emphasizes in Genealogy of Morals about the festivity associated, the excessive enjoyment associated with punishment. The horror then lies in the fact, as Freud reminded us, that civilization annihilates its own creation. Judith Butler puts it succinctly: the other problem with civilization is that it seems actively to dismantle what it has built, to destroy what one brings into being. It takes aims at its own creation and attachment, pursuing a furtive vocation, repetitive unknowing that works in contrary direction to its forward-oriented tasks, and all conceits of progress. She goes on to read Freud in an overall context of death penalty and remarks, quoting her, Freud ends his Civilization and its discontents, remarking that civilization runs the risk of being undone by its own aggression. going so far as to voice his anxiety about the prospect of extermination. Killing then becomes, in this festive moment, a sport, a festivity or celebration in phantasmatic imagination, inaugurating the neoliberal violent subjectivity. The uniqueness of such imaginary violence is that the power score of the repressed violence that remain intact despite the outward appearance of humanized, civilized, and sanitized forms of punishment. So the argument being that this civilized sensibility on the outside has this deep underbelly and core of violent outbursts, which becomes a moment to celebrate and festively do. Gopal Gandhi, in his recent book on death penalty, comments on 3 recent executions in India, and he aptly illustrates the point. He says, and I quote him, that the executions could not be watched by public, but they were also closely followed in media as India-Pakistan cricket match would be. The pathology and complexity of analogic connection between human execution and cricket is at once opposite and troubling. This is the troubled core of the social unconscious, which can further find support in the discursive populistic governmental demands of preventive coercive measures in times of terror. One has to carefully analyze the entangled knot of unconscious desires and drives in their relationship with discursive fears of security to begin to understand the gap between public sentiment and criminal justice. What, after all, is the history of genealogy of this festive dimension of punishment? The legal subject imagines that the pleasure obtained by such infliction of suffering on the other provides a form of a recompense. So this violent of infliction is a kind of a compensation. Here I think Nietzsche presages the later distinction that psychoanalysis draws between pleasure and enjoyment. The pleasure attained by injured party is a strange pleasure. Injured party when it inflicts pain on the criminal, on the guilty. One may suspect that the pleasure as a right to inflict suffering is an excessive or surplus pleasure. It has to be excessive, Nietzsche's word, as actual recompense is an impossibility. You cannot have a compensation. So the pleasure derived is more than necessary, and ironically through counter pain inflicted on the offender. It is strange enough. An equivalence is provided by the creditors receiving in place of literal compensation for the injury. Thus, in place of money, land, possessions of any kind, a recompense in the form of kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely upon the one who is powerless. The voluptuous pleasure, Nietzsche describes, the enjoyment to violate, the enjoyment of violation. The compensation then consists in warrant for the title to cruelty, says Nietzsche. This is where Nietzsche inaugurates the principle of biopsychology, a notion of cruelty which ironically forms the foundation of legal common sense and the legal subject. It is in this context that Nietzsche accuses Kantian categorical imperative of jus talionis, the principle of equivalence, that proportionality of crime and punishment, as rooted in calculations and more importantly cruelty. Because how do you have jus talionis and proportionality when there is an impossibility at the heart of crime and punishment? The categorical imperative, argues Nietzsche, is on the same page. Smells of cruelty, and he says smells of cruelty. Nietzsche goes on to emphasize the birth of this peculiar phenomenon of institutionalized cruelty, though Nietzsche does not speak of it, finds it crescendo when it is epitomized in the peculiar institution of death penalty. To ask it again, and I'll leave that and I'll move on to my final point, Nietzsche, in sketching the genealogy of punishment, also points to the ironical reality of criminal law. When the criminal law punishes by infliction of pain on the guilty, it gives legitimacy to the impossible possibility of satisfaction by making the other suffer. So, a possibility which is actually impossible. Every act of punishing is also a reiteration of cruelty, reinstating the legal subjectivity that may embarrassingly develop into the collective conscience of the social, which ought to find an orgasmic satisfaction in making the other suffer. As if this satisfaction of criminal law resonates with the idea of enjoyment as superego injunction in psychoanalysis, it is a burden to enjoy, but a burden that one has to love or learn to love, to believe in cruelty as recompense. This is important, as this complexity forms the very core of criminal law. Therefore, any effort to wish away the desire for cruelty the shoulds that Latika talk about, or drives of aggression as a rational choice are doomed to fail. One has to acknowledge that functional dimension of the law plays a part in construction of the aggressive forms of cruelty, which is proclaimed to eradicate through the same act which reinforces such drives. This ironical structure of law requires a psychoanalysis of the latent self which is hidden. This is how I understand and fully reiterate the Foucauldian claim that Enlightenment categories of progress or humanism are just not adequate for totally understand the normative structure of the law. The fact that policy pronouncement which attempts to cash and carry type of reforms are doomed to mirror the endless cycle of Sisyphean labors, which would end up circular, repetitive mythological wheel, which we talk about. And I'll skip my paper and just to come to the last part, that we need to diagnose the self of the law and the citizen subject to realize its deep roots in cruelty, which I am talking about. Reinforced by the everydayness of the legal decision making. This is the everydayness of the law. This is the everydayness of the common sense that we are supposed to believe, we are supposed to imbibe, we are supposed to, it should be embedded in the psyche. This has to be put in analysis so as to begin the task of reformulation of a social without reproducing the circles of violence. We must realize that the task at hand of rethinking the criminal law through a discussion on death penalty requires psychoanalysis as much as it requires a closer understanding of theology. A reform proposal for crime and punishment which fails to see cruelty reproduced in individual psyche and as a social norm in every pronouncement of criminal law is doomed to be a new civilized proposal for repression. And as we are told in the Lacanian reformulation of the Freudian notion of repression, whatever is refused in the symbolic order, in the sense of foreclosure, reappears in the real.